Welcome to the 2020 Virtual Atlanta Journal-Constitution Decatur Book Festival presented by Emory University. I'm Mike Jordan, multimedia journalist and food writer based here in Atlanta. I'm pleased to introduce the speaker for tonight's Cooknote, which is one of the most prominent writers in the culinary landscape today. But first, I'd like to recognize and honor our great sponsors. This year's culinary conversations are presented also with Whole Foods Market. And tonight's session is also sponsored by Springer Mountain Farms, the poultry of choice for leading chefs across the U.S. Springer is a family-owned company that has led the way in many innovations in humanely raised poultry, in addition to the movements focused on antibiotic-free and Project Non-GMO verified chicken. We appreciate their support of our industry and of tonight's conversation. Now back to Toni Tipton-Martin, my friend. Toni Tipton-Martin is an award-winning food and nutrition journalist and historian who is busy building a healthier community through her books, classes, and her foundation. She is a two-time James Beard Book Award winner and has appeared as a guest judge on Bravo Top Chef. She was honored by First Lady Michelle Obama and for her work to improve the health of American families, and was also awarded the Southern Foodways Alliance's John Egerton Award for these initiatives. Toni owns and curates one of the world's largest historic collections of cookbooks written by African Americans. Her first James Beard Award-winning book, The Jemima Code, 2 Centuries of African American Cooks, told the stories of these unsung authors. Toni followed up with her most recent book, Jubilee, 2 Centuries of African American Cooking. And Jubilee was awarded the James Beard Award for Best American Cookbook. Congratulations again, Toni. Toni is an important voice when it comes to recognizing the contributions of African Americans to our country's food culture. And so again, it is my pleasure to hand it over to my friend, Toni Tipton-Martin, and also to our MC, food writer and journalist, and another friend of mine, Susan Puckett. Take it away.
Or am I on? Hey everyone, and hey Toni, it's so great to be with you.
Hey Susan, this is so much fun.
Yeah.
Week.
I know. And you know, I'm so crazy about Jubilee, and I know I've been talking. I've been talking it up to all of my friends because it's really been of all the huge collection of books I have, it's the one I'm probably cooking with the most. And I really do think, you know, like in Jubilee, or rather the Jemima Code, what Barbara Haber said about how the Jemima Code was going to change the way people see the history of American food. And I really think both the Jemima Code and Jubilee have done that. And so there's kind of a lot to unpack, and trying to think about where to begin. And I think is the fact that both of us are old school newspaper food journalists at heart. And we both got into this actually almost around the same time, just when food writing and newspaper food writing was, it was something more than just the women's pages, and it was actually food journalism. And in reading your books, that I can see the journalist in you so much that comes through, and in that, you know, I think we both like being the observers as opposed to the necessarily the center of the story. And that to me is so much of what your work is about. And so I'd like to start just by asking you, you know, what made you decide to be a journalist, and how'd you get into food journalism?
Yeah, well, thanks so much for your kind words. You know, we'll talk about recipes, I'm sure, later, but one of the most terrifying thoughts that I had was that my peers, my friends, other food journalists were going to be the ones reviewing these books, right? And so that's very high praise coming from you. So thank you so much for that. I was a reluctant food writer. I did not have any interest in food journalism at all. I was a student at the University of Southern California. I'm not going to go back over my whole history, but that's the starting point. At which time I had a professor who suggested that working at a weekly newspaper would be a way to get into the news business. And back then you could still do that, right? It was a little bit further away than from the old days when there was a copy boy running, copy from the writer to the desk. But you could make your way starting in the features department and then move over to hard news. And my heart and soul was in hard news. So I got this little job at a local weekly newspaper in LA. And not very long after, the editor told me that I was going to have to do the food pages because I was part-time and I had the most flexibility in my schedule. And so she gave me the instructions on how to do it. And I was not thrilled. She sat me down and showed me a recipe and said, okay, this list at the top, make sure when you read that that all of those items are mentioned in the paragraph below, and then double back and make sure that everything mentioned in the paragraph is in the list, put a head on it and send it over to the room. And, again, back then, press materials were the thing. Manufacturers sent in all kinds of copy, so you didn't have to do very much writing. A lot of it was rewrite, and that didn't interest me at all. But the LA Times had an opening not long after that, and I was hired there. And so the food world just kept opening up for me, mostly because of that very first choice that I made to go with what seemed to be grunt work, right, to me at the time.
Right. Yeah, we all had to do that grunt work.
Right.
But so much of your work has revolved around dispelling stereotypes, and your own background is definitely not a stereotype. And I think when people think of African American cooking, they automatically think Southern cornbread or whatever. Can you talk about what it was like growing up in California, and how your mother cooked?
Yeah, they don't think that it's a monolithic cuisine associated only with the boundaries of the South and soul food anymore. So this may seem strange to some of our viewers, but there was a time when the expectation was African American cooking was limited to the boundaries of the South, so Southern dishes, but mostly to foods of survival. We have been very proud, and rightly so, of what was accomplished by our ancestors who were working cooking with ingredients that were lesser quality, from the master's kitchen, whatever they could forage and procure from the woods around them. And we should be very proud of that. But my mother, as I said in the Jemima Code, made skid marks when she left the South. The oppressive racism was really hard on her generation. And what I understand is that what I thought was was an experience limited to me, has proven to be true for so many migrant families. And they just wanted to put the South and the pain behind them. And so my mother adopted two different styles of cooking that she integrated with her Southern experience. One of those was south of the border cooking because of the large Mexican influence in Los Angeles. But also when I was in middle school, she lost not only her mother, but also her brother to health issues. And it was catastrophic to her. She became like really obsessed with food as medicine. So she became a pescatarian, and I am writing my memoir joking about the memories of the crazy things she had in the refrigerator. I mean, you know, she really jumped all the way into the health food movement. And we would drive to Santa Monica, you know, to go shopping. There was a health food store out there, a hippie grocery store called Mrs. Gooch's. And we would shop there. And so between that and making our own tacos, as I talk about in Jubilee, I had a very diverse food experience. Our table was very mixed, but there were Southern dishes there. You know, cornbread was a staple, red beans and rice. She made greens and neck bones and things like that. They just didn't ever describe it as Southern, right, or soul food. She was just making dinner.
Right, right. When did you really start to appreciate Southern food?
Oh, what a great question. You'll be able to relate to this. You know, my introduction to that internal part of myself that had not been nurtured came at the hands of a woman that we both know and love named Vera Beck. And Vera was the test kitchen cook at the Plain Dealer. And she was, prior to that position, she was the cafeteria cook. And she was from Athens, Alabama. She was an incredible cook. And her dexterity was constantly on display, right? You could see her making incredible Southern food one minute, you know, for herself or me. And then she would, you know, test all these amazing recipes that we ran in the section. But one of the ways that she lured me into my Southern self was I was pregnant with my middle son, and every now and then I would get this phone call on my private line, and she would say, I need to see you in here right now. You know, she had that demeanor.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And so I thought that meant there was an emergency. She ran into a problem with a recipe or something. And I'd go in the kitchen, and there was this incredible Southern breakfast. She knew that I loved fried catfish and grits and scrambled eggs and biscuits. And she kept telling me that she needed to help me make sure I had a healthy, happy baby. And so she wanted that baby to be brought up on Southern breakfast. It was very cool.
Yeah. And the reason why that we can connect over this was because our ships just barely almost crossed in the night, and that I was at the Plain Dealer before, I think a year or two before you came on board. And when we first met, we realized we had the Vera Beck connection. But
yeah,
it was interesting when we were talking the other day about how, in my case, you know, being from the South, she was my connection to home because I was in Yankee territory, you know, and with you, you know, she, like you know, kind of reawakened this part of you. Well, so how did the Jemima Code come about? And what do you mean by Jemima Code?
Well, in some ways, the Jemima Code is a testament, you know, an homage to Vera Beck. Mm-hmm. I was working for the Los Angeles Times and realized that the stereotyping of African-American women who cooked was pervasive. And there wasn't really a counterbalance in all of that stuff that we had in the newsroom, cookbooks and press kits and files of recipes. There was no African-American presence there. I didn't really know what to do about that until I met Vera. And I still wasn't entirely sure, but I knew that there was encoded language, right? That here could be this incredibly brilliant woman with a heart as big as Texas, and just, golden. And yet she was disparaged everywhere that I looked on the pages of history, whether that was in film or in recipe books. And I know that I knew this was going to be hard, because some of our closest friends had written some of those, books that didn't necessarily disparage the Black women. They just left them out of the discussion, right? So books would say things like New Orleans cooking was an amalgamation of the cooking of the French and the Spanish and the Acadians and others. Like it would just, we were the others.
The others, yeah.
And that happened a lot. So I wasn't yet sure how I was going to break that code. But at some point, after being involved with Southern Foodways Alliance, it occurred to me that cookbooks might be a way to encounter more women like Vera.
Yeah.
Knowing that I wasn't from the South and I didn't have deep roots in the South, I entertained the idea of initially creating a cookbook that would tap into the women of the church. And that way I could retain my investigative skills and practices, and I could travel the South and interview all of these amazing women who often, cooked for dinners for Friday night fundraising. They certainly made the repasts after services. They cooked on Sundays. And I thought that would be a really great solution. And so the Jemima Code just evolved as I kept considering different ways to find people to interview.
Yeah. Well, how did you get into the cookbook collecting?
Yeah, I did. I also was a reluctant cookbook collector. I read about a bibliography of African American cookbooks at the University of Alabama in a incredible piece of scholarship by Doris Witt called Black Hunger. And she had this bibliography of recipe books that dated back to 1827 through the present time. At that point, I think it was like 1999. And so I made copies of that book at the library and entered those titles of those recipe books into my computer browser, hoping that as antique book dealers were starting to put their inventory online, maybe one of those books would become available. Because when I tried to check them out at the library, obviously they were so rare that unless you were in the region where the book was published, it was very unlikely that you could find that original book. So I grew frustrated pretty quickly in trying to access those old books, and so purchasing them just became the default. Was the only way I could see inside of them without traveling.
And how many do you have? About how many do you have now?
Well, now I have over 400 of them. So when I wrote the Jemima Code, there were about 350.
Wow.
In 2015. But since then, more sources have become available. People have started sending them to me, which is really sweet. And the bibliography at the University of Alabama has more than 400 on it. And that list includes duplicate, multiple editions, facsimiles, and of course they have a massive collection of local books, church ladies' books, things that I didn't think I would ever have access to, because people bring them to libraries. But now I have a source here in Virginia, and she's turned me on to some really incredible sources. I've got some new books now that are, I've discovered that the NAACP was doing cookbooks.
Wow.
Or, different entities that were creating books that, I have a whole nother set of books that could create a volume 2 of the Jemima.
Well, I believe it. And I think the most difficult thing had to have been, how do you cull this material down? And can you talk about just about Jubilee and how it is a continuation of the Jemima Code, but in this this very, very intentional, focused way? And I was very interested in Arturo Schomburg and the two lines that for the framework of your book.
Of course.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So when I realized that I had this massive collection, and the idea of a scholarly work that would break the code that I began to see in scholarship that described two different types of African Americans involved with the food world and cooking. We always heard about the slave cabin cooks and the survival cooks, and as I said at the beginning, you know, just the incredible dexterity that those cooks had with their ability to make something, as we say, out of nothing. But what we very seldom talked about, but dwelled a lot on in historical fiction or even in history, were the women who were cooking inside the house, plantation cooks, domestic workers, people who operated oyster houses, and mixologists and bartenders, and what I began to see as a professional set of African Americans, right? So there were these two different categories running side by side all of the time in written documentation, but very seldom ever investigated deeper than a brief mention that, you know, Black women had toiled in the plantation kitchen, right? It was always associated with the labor and the harshness, and nothing that would inspire anyone to want to cook, right? You know, that old saying, slaving in the kitchen, derives from that. And so as a food person, I was disturbed just by that. You know, I just thought, how will we ever inspire the next generation if we're continually making them feel like they descend only from the most arduous aspects of the culinary field, especially if we talk again about food writing and chefs food writers and chefs who are constantly talking about their inspiration, right? Oh, they were inspired by their grandmother and cooking at somebody's knee and so on. So again, as part of this research and my trying to get educated about food history, I discovered a book proposal by a scholar named Arturo Schomburg. And the Schomburg Library in New York City is named after him. He was a Puerto Rican scholar who had a particularly wide open lens when it came to Black history. And he wanted to tell all kinds of stories and decided that there were these two strains. So there it was, right before my eyes, finally someone in history had validated what I was starting to already summarize and to surmise. Unfortunately, I could not sell a book like that to an agent or to New York publishers. Nobody was interested in this counter narrative. Schomburg's proposal was too obscure. And so my work was rejected for the most part. I was also a stay-at-home mother. I had left my career, I had left the newsroom some years earlier. And so my reputation, I'm sure, you know, they wanted somebody with more of an academic background, right, to write this. But the proposals that I submitted were in two categories. I wrote a proposal for a collection of essays that would be very historical in nature and tell this story the way you would tell it, you know, in a scholarly fashion. And I proposed a cookbook. So I had the two proposals all along running side by side. I just had nowhere to sell them. And so the idea for Jubilee existed all along. It was right there alongside the historical data. And that's what you see now on the pages of Jubilee, is that coming together of both aspects of the work.
Well, I can really appreciate just my being, especially being an editor, just the synthesizing of this material. And what I love is that every recipe, there's so much story there, and there's so many aha moments, of things that I never considered or thought about. And what we were talking about earlier is, and talking about those two threads or whatever, is a couple of the recipes that I tested in one meal. One were these rice muffins, and another was this very elegant, fabulous. It was a corn and potato, a rich chowder with crab meat in it. And just to put a face on these recipes, can you talk a little bit about the people behind those?
Sure. So it was important to me, having seen African American professionals erased from the record, the written record. And so one of the main focuses for me was to be able to provide attribution on every recipe. I wanted us to
really appreciate
I really wanted us to be able to tie these dishes back to their origins. And I knew that, obviously, as an editor, I was also self-editing, right? So I'm bracing for the criticism that these are just Southern dishes, or these are classic cakes. How could she claim those are African American? And that is all something that others will have to disentangle, how it is that we can have dishes that coexist between cultures, across class, across race. I did not want to get into that argument with anybody. I wanted to celebrate what had been hidden. And so naming those cooks was really important to me. So the process for arriving at recipes on a page and ultimately who was named is a little bit lengthy. Do we want to talk about it the long way? Is that all right?
Let's talk about it the short way, maybe. So
the short way is I created a template.
Yeah.
And went through. I chose certain time periods to certain cookbooks that I knew were dependable, and that reflected a certain style, whether they were New Orleans cookbooks or something from the South or soul food or whatever. And then I would just test the recipe as it was across those generations. And then that would mean that I would have the name of the chef. None of these people listed head notes. There was no context for these recipes, no perspective, really, other than just rice muffins, right? So if rice muffins kept showing up across generations, I knew that it had some sustainability as an icon, as part of our canon. And then I tried to tell a small piece of history about each one of those various cooks. But then I would ultimately settle on one of them as the main story that I would tell, and the recipe that I would adapt for the page.
Because with the rice muffins, and correct me if I'm getting this confused, but wasn't the originator of that one from South Carolina on the rice plantations?
She was. Her name was Leslie Bowers. And there was a habit of using leftover broken rice instead of flour, or in addition to flour, as an augment to make the muffins have a good quality, a good texture. And so if you see that in isolation, you just think, oh, make rice, and this recipe is a rice muffin, without realizing that that's one of those make something out of nothing, be good stewards of your environment, environmental, no waste, right? All of those characteristics that we talk about today that are such important virtues associated with the food world repurposing, didn't have a name back then.
Right.
You just use the leftover and you save the bacon grease, and that's just what you did.
And now the no waste is so on trend now.
Right, exactly right. And then the other dish that you described, the corn and potato chowder with crab.
Yeah.
That is Schomburg had all 3 chowders in his original recipe list. So there was a corn chowder, there was a potato chowder, and there was a crab soup. And I quickly discovered I could not include all of them, or this book would be over 1,000 recipes long. So I began looking in modern cookbooks to see how these dishes persisted over the years and what current chefs were doing to modernize them. So the version that you're infatuated with actually comes from a singer named Khalees. And people may know her as the woman who sang "My Milkshake Brings All the Boys to the Door." And I like to say that her corn chowder brings all the boys to the door, because she actually has a recipe in her cookbook. She's the Cordon Bleu trained, and she has a recipe that concentrates all 3. So it was just a miraculous way for me to give respect and honor to the old dishes, but to talk about them in a modern way.
Well, and to me, that is one thing. I can't think of any other cookbook that I've seen that just so deftly and seamlessly, I mean, you don't just, many of these recipes don't just credit one person, but actually credit several people. And you talk about how they came together for, I think, just one new recipe, maybe through the Toni Tipton-Martin best version of these recipes. And I think, but to me, I mean, that's what every good enthusiastic cook does, is like, and what I really love so much about this book is the fact that you're not just talking about these general places where something came from, or a whole general people, but they are specific people with names and faces, and you might pick up one little tidbit from this chef or that chef, and it makes for fun reading too. And mentioning the singer. I mean, there are a number of celebrities that appear, like Pearl Bailey, and who were some of the other some of the entertainers or kind of well-known people that you wouldn't necessarily connect with food.
Well, we the thing about the Jemima Code is that it showed the trends in publishing, so that you could see what was happening by decade, who was getting published. And we went through a period where celebrities were considered the food experts, which was really insulting to me as a food writer.
Yes.
Thinking there are plenty of us that do have this legitimate experience, and publishers were continually running to the likes of Isaac Hayes, Pearl Bailey, Gladys Knight, Patti LaBelle. No disrespect to them, and we all know Patti LaBelle had a great run on a sweet potato pie here a few years back that she produced and manufactured. But it was just more of the same. It was still not giving true African-American cooks their due.
Right.
One of the things that was important to me, or continues to be important to me, is racial reconciliation and using food as a tool for us to get there. Creating room at the table for everyone. And what I wanted to also do with this book was give people permission to adapt the recipes, because historically that had been done anyway, but we've called it appropriating. We've said that it was theft. And all of that is certainly true. but if we're going to ever move on, we need to give people tools for how to make the changes we're protesting and
Right.
asking, to have changed. And so I thought by giving people names,
Mm-hmm.
not only did it serve as memory for my ancestors, but it also means that someone like you that has tested, and made the coconut cake or the soup can tell that story now. And it's not about me. I'm the vessel, right? Now there's just so much more intrigue and so much
Yeah.
more fun associated with the dish. And the numbers of people on Instagram that have, since this book came out, that have posted their versions of it and are talking about the tweaks that they've made. That's really exciting to me. It means that
Yeah.
recipes will live on, and it takes some of that edge off. It doesn't mean that we don't still have plenty of way to go in dealing with appropriating and equity discussions at the table. But this is a start. I'm doing what I can do in my lane.
Right.
And I'm
Right.
encouraging people who buy my book to see that there are real people behind the recipes. And so when you use currants instead of raisins, you can know that, Edna Lewis would have used raisins, and Toni used currants, and Susan used, dates. And that's okay. That's okay.
Right, right. Well, and speaking of it's Instagramming photo, I've actually Instagrammed several of your recipes. The one I was the most proud of was the coconut cake that I made for my husband's birthday. That was such a hit because that actually he has been requesting a coconut cake with a lemon filling just about since we've been married, because that's what his mother made for a birthday
Oh,
party.
wow. Yeah.
And after rummaging through a number of cookbooks, I looked in Jubilee, and it's like, I think this is the one, and it was spot on. But what I really love about that recipe is the head note that goes with it, where you give a little history about cakewalks, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, so I was juggling a lot of things with this book, as is evident on the pages, and editor hat first and foremost, probably, and realized that there would be a question tying African Americans to a coconut cake that is a dominant Southern dish.
Mm-hmm.
Especially for folks that are still seeing us primarily through the cabin and survival cooking. Like, where did they get the sugar, and how did they make that? And, how that I was expecting. And what I discovered in slave narratives, which were taken in the 1930s as part of the Works Progress Administration's effort to get writers back to work, they interviewed formerly enslaved people, and the discussion of the cakewalk came up. And several people talk about having a coconut cake as part of the prize for the winner of this little dance celebration that existed in the woods or behind the cabins or someplace that the enslaved people would be in isolation from the landholders. Again, the question obviously, well, then where did they get the sugar? And we can't say that it was exactly this coconut cake. But what we can say is that they describe Christmas time when plantation owners gave them extra special ingredients that they could cook with. So we can assume that that's how they got the ingredients on their how they got the ingredients. But another validation of the idea of this being part of this celebration, the cakewalk dance, was a gentleman who, during the minstrel era, became known as the cakewalk king. And it turned out his mother was one of those formerly enslaved people who told him this story about how the cakewalk began. And it began with the enslaved folks basically mocking the plantation household for their elaborate balls and their dances. And the folks would go back into the woods, and then they would parade around in a circle and created their own version of the cakewalk. Is it what we know to be today that we play at, kid parties? I don't know, but we do have a number of points across history that tie that cake to a celebration that was held in the woods by the enslaved people who had an opportunity to create a special cake for themselves when times were tough.
Wow.
Yeah. So I tried to tell the stories with all of those layers without it becoming too long and too heavy. I wanted us to remember that these are moments to celebrate.
Yeah. And everything. It's just it's such a joy to cook from, and especially I think it gets back to the fact that you're, as a former newspaper food writer and editor, you're used to dealing with a lot of home cooks and all of our dumb questions, and so that was very much appreciated. Well, before, we're almost out of time, but can you tell us what's next on your agenda?
Well, I have a couple of big announcements that are going to be coming in the next week or so. I am currently writing my memoir, so I'm going back over time and peeling the scabs off of a lot of these food stories and talking about my kitchens where I've lived and worked. I have also, I'm in the midst of negotiating to create the Jubilee series.
Oh, wow.
So we want to be able to keep this style of book going. And so there'll be more about that in the days to come. So I just have a lot going on and a lot of really exciting ways to bring us all together at one big table. And, just as I said, in my lane of breaking down stereotypes so that we can learn to hear each other differently, more truthfully, more authentically. And all of the projects that I'll be talking about in the coming weeks are going to solidify that philosophy and approach from me for the food world.
Wow. Well, that is that's very exciting. And well, on that note, we're opening this up. We're opening this up to questions, and I think I should be getting some pretty soon.
Okay. Let's see. I can see them. Can you see?
I'm not seeing them. Oh, here we go. Okay. Okay. First question: do you have a favorite recipe?
I do have a favorite recipe. I'm a baker, and my favorite recipe is the lemon tea cake by Melinda Russell from 1866. Somebody recently on Instagram made it with key lime juice.
Ooh.
And so that sounds really good to me. I'm going to try that.
And why is that your favorite?
It is so decadent. And it's a normal pound cake with a ton of lemon zest in it, but you poke holes over the surface of the cake while it's warm and drizzle it with a lemon glaze that soaks in.
Ooh. And oh gosh,
it's really good. And it's a version of a cake that Doll makes at Stitt's place.
In Birmingham.
In Birmingham at Highland
Grove.
Yeah. So that's my favorite, is the sweet. And of course the shrimp that are on the cover of the book is another favorite for me.
That totally looks yummy. Can you name a few of the top restaurants in the country that celebrate this tradition authentically?
Well, I think we have to be really careful about the word authentically. What Jubilee, the meaning of the word Jubilee is we're free. So we are free now to appreciate whichever way that chefs determine is their ancestry and the way they want to promote their food culture. I will be talking with 3 of those professionals in the coming weeks for the festival. Mm-hmm. Todd Richards, who's right there in Atlanta.
Oh, yeah.
We'll be talking. Chris Williams, who is in Houston. Mm-hmm. And Tiffany Barriere, who's a mixologist. And all 3 of them are mentioned in Jubilee. Mm-hmm. Their recipes are provided there. So we're going to talk more and more about authenticity in the coming weeks for the festival. So stay tuned for that.
Well, fun. I will have to tune in for that. Well, within your cookbook collection, which cookbook do you appreciate the most?
Well, I think I would go tie again back to Melinda Russell. She's just my overall favorite. Mm-hmm. I have a very special relationship with Edna Lewis, but I feel like we need to be able to maybe think about others too. Mm-hmm. And give credit to some other folks. And Melinda Russell was a free woman of color in 1866, and she was also a single mom. So I give her a shout out because I want her to be an inspiration that encourages so many young women who have a hard way to go, and to realize that this woman, at a time of terrible enslavement of African Americans, she had her own bakery. Mm-hmm. She had a boarding house, and she produced a cookbook.
Oh, wow.
So I really hold her up as a great model for women, young women.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And somebody asked, what do you see in the future for Black cuisine? More fusion, more regionalism, more African influence, and
all of those things. That is the beauty of Jubilee. I intentionally integrated aspects of African diaspora cooking to provide evidence that food had been with us all along. And hopefully that will give respect to the incredible chefs that are doing such amazing things right now in all of those spheres. And so I don't see yet that one of those is going to dominate. Right now, folks are feeling free and cooking joyously within all of those realms.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's all the questions we've got. But before we sign off, I do want to take a moment to remind everybody that the book festival is it's nonprofit, and it depends on donations to keep the programming and eventually bring this back to the physical festival, which I know we were both at last year, I believe, and I hope next year we'll be able to do that.
I hope so. Having the cooking demos as part of the conversation is so much of an important aspect for just the sights and the smells associated with cooking. That's the part that's missing for me right now. I was tempted to have, a little piece of Melinda Russell's cake.
I know.
Like that.
I know. And we've got just this beautiful weather to
be outside.
God, this would be such a great time. But still, this has been fun. Somebody asks, are casseroles a part of this tradition? I'm not thinking about sweet potato casserole that's included in Jubilee, but other kinds of casseroles.
There are, for sure. And in the original version of this book, I had tuna casserole. We tend to think about casseroles and one dish cooking as foods made with convenience foods. Mm-hmm. And so we sort of poo-poo that, right? If we're home cooks, we want to think that we make everything fresh with, ingredients we just bought this morning at the farmer's market. And what I like about the idea of casseroles is they are an example for us of the affluence for African Americans and the ability
Yes.
to purchase convenience foods, right? When
Mm-hmm.
we think about making tuna casserole, for example, we can make a white sauce, a bechamel sauce from scratch using flour and butter
Mm-hmm.
and milk or cream or broth or water. Um, but we have to stand there and make that sauce, right? And so the convenience associated with the canned soup was a liberator for for all cooks. At one point in the 50s when they really were popular, they allowed us to use a little bit of this and a little bit of that, whatever we had on hand. If you had some tuna, if you had some pasta, you could throw together a one dish meal. But what I like for us to remember about casseroles is the fact that they allowed African Americans to be free from the labor of having to make cream of mushroom soup, right?
Yeah.
For example, which is the basis of a lot of these dishes. The green bean casserole, of course, shows up in recipe books across generations. So yeah, there are casseroles as part of the African American canon.
Yeah. Well, one thing as we're talking, and I love that you keep, going back to this, just this joyfulness, with that often is, like you say, you hear a lot about, the drudgery but I know it's been very exciting for me just being part of the food scene and just seeing so much creativity that's coming out of the African American community and besides restaurant world and cookbook world. And I wanted you to maybe talk for a few minutes about your team, particularly your photographer.
Yeah, having this history and seeing the level of professionalism and that African Americans within the food world crossed all boundaries. There were all sorts of career paths for us. And so I asked my publisher for part of my contract condition was, one of my conditions was to have a Black creative team. And in Jarrell Guy, we discovered that we had a food stylist, a prop stylist, and a photographer all bundled into one.
It's such a gorgeous book, and you can just the photos. I mean, there's just so much warmth, and you can just I can just feel the chemistry between the two of you.
Well, and what's really lovely, and I just adore her and love giving her the full 100% credit that I was not on set with her.
Wow.
I did
a lot of trust there.
I did some tests. I did a couple of photo shoot tests with other photographers because we knew that we wanted this book to have a particular feel, knowing that there had been so much difficulty getting it to market in the first place.
Yeah.
But she and I had an instant connection. We related so much to several of the authors. She just happens to love Melinda Russell as much as I do. And, she just did some really brilliant things. I sent her a box of family heirlooms.
Oh, wow.
And we talked a lot at the beginning, but then she was off and running. And so opening her photos was like opening Christmas gifts.
Well, it's really cool in cookbooks when the photography just really tells the story. I mean, it's not just that it's beautiful, appetizing looking food, but it just I feel like it really sets the mood and the tone. There is one more question.
Well, sure. And let me just say this: as an editor, I had been reviewing, writer and editor, I had been reviewing cookbooks for years, so I knew all of those nuances that would be looked for in a cookbook that you're describing. And I was able to challenge the publisher and say, if your argument, if the marketing argument is that Black books don't sell, which was one of the things that Black folks, have heard a lot. maybe it's the books that were being produced.
Right.
And so I offered that challenge by saying, this woman makes gorgeous photos. Let's see what we can do with a different kind of design, with a hybrid type of book, and see if that critique of low sales still stands. And
I have a feeling it doesn't.
it didn't, but Jubilee is headed for its 8th printing.
Wow.
So thank you to all of everyone who's with us today.
Yeah.
Supporting.
There's one quick, somebody just said,
Okay.
I have a family history of Southern cooks. I now think the recipes may be from their African cooks. How do I determine where these recipes came from, and does it make a difference?
I'm not sure that it makes, I'm not sure that there's anything you can do to extract that truth. Recipes are very precious to all of us. They're private. There are some strains of Africanisms that you can see in recipes, but unfortunately a lot of that blended into the Southern canon. So our tendency to cook with a lot of aromatic vegetables and to cook with hot sauce. I talk about a lot of those kinds of things. Those elements disappeared into the Southern canon. It matters if it matters to you. I have had so many people over the years of this work talking to me about the women in their households that mattered so much and that they never gave any credit to. If there is still a family member who might know, that would be the way to get that information. But I'm not sure that looking back, there's much you can do about it.
Yeah.
We should just look forward.
Yes.
Know that is probably likely. And that there was some kind of a synergistic relationship that happened between Black and white women in kitchens a lot of the time in the South, and that we can respect one another for our contributions without having to unnecessarily dwell on ownership.
Well, I think that's a great way to end it. I think we've gone actually a few minutes over, so I hope that's okay. But this has been so much fun, and thanks for everybody who joined in on. This was my very first Zoom interview. And Toni, good luck with everything, and I can't wait to. I just can't wait to hear what's next for you. And,
thank you so much, Susan. Thank you, everyone who tuned in. Your support means everything, and you keep me motivated to keep pressing on. So, thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Thanks
Good night.
for the festival. Good night.
Good night, everybody.